we're going to pick up where we left off drawing our sphere, and that was drawing the ellipse for the cast shadow. So what I was just doing was drawing around and around and around very lightly between the two furthest points of my cast shadow until I get a nice ellipse. And then just like I did with my circle, I'm going to go back and I'm going to erase away any of the extra lines until I have a nice clean ellipse. It's okay if I erase the ground line in this process because I don't need it anymore now that I have figured out where the cast shadow goes. But I am trying to leave in the bottom of my sphere because I do need that. So now I have a nice ellipse. I'm going to go back in and just clean it up a little bit. I'm going to clean up my sphere because I didn't mean to erase that part. And then I can erase all my extra lines. So I'm erasing this part of the cast shadow because that is behind my object, so I wouldn't be able to see it through the object. It's a solid object. I'm erasing the lines from my light source because those were just used to figure out where my cast shadow would fall. And I'm cleaning up any little extra marks. Then I'm going in one last time, cleaning up my lines, getting ready for shading. As I clean up my lines, I'm making sure that all of the lines are nice and light, so I don't have any dark outlines that I'm dealing with once I start my shading. And you may even want to go back and lightly go over all your lines with your eraser just to lighten them up one last time. This is going to make your life easier once you start shading away your outlines. All right, I am ready to shade. So I'm going to start with my cast shadow, and I'm using my darkest pencil. And remember that the cast shadow is darkest right underneath the object. And that's true on both sides of my sphere. So it's going to be a shape like this. A little mini ellipse shape, similar to our outer ellipse shape of our cast shadow. So that's the darkest part right underneath the object. And you can imagine, as I go out, just to get a little preview of how I'm doing this, if this is my sphere and here's my cast shadow, it's going to be darker right underneath, and then as it moves out, it's going to get lighter and lighter and lighter. So that's the shape that my shadow is going to be in. We'll zoom in again to see the rest of the shading of this cast shadow. So from here, just like I showed you before, I'm starting to get lighter and lighter and lighter as I fade towards the edges. And the reason that my shadow is getting lighter is because indirect light is starting to filter into it as it falls farther away from the shadow. So there I have a nice cast shadow for my sphere. Just going to touch up the bottom parts to really help define that bottom edge of the sphere. Next, I'm ready to shade my object itself. So I'm going to start with the shadow part of my object, and that's going to be on this bottom right-hand side because my light is coming in from this direction. So it's going to be most highlighted right here, and then more shadow, more shadow, more shadow as it gets towards the bottom. The shadow on the sphere, if we look back up here in our little example, the highlighted part is going to be right about here, and then as it fades out from the highlight, our shadows are going to start getting darker in a shape that looks like this. The shadows are going to be very rounded so that they look like they go all the way around the sphere. The way we do not want to draw our shadows or shade our shadows is like this. This is a mistake that lots of people make where they put the highlight right on the edge and then all the shadows are crescent shaped, but they're not crescent shaped that are curvy enough on the sides. They're a little flatter on the sides. And you can see how this doesn't really look as 3D as this one. So we really want it to make it look like it has the illusion of being three-dimensional. So let's see what this looks like when we actually do the shading. I'm going to start at the bottom, and I'm going to start shading with probably my darkest pencil. I'm using my 6B right now. And one little trick that I didn't talk about yet is that on the very bottom edge of our form, we can leave a tiny sliver of light, and that's creating what's called a luminous edge. It's a little trick that artists use by leaving a very light edge next to an area that's shadowed, and that shows where there's a tiny bit of reflected light bouncing off just this very outer edge of our object. If you make this edge too wide, it looks really weird, so it has to be very, very skinny if you include it at all. Your drawing will still look pretty good even if you don't include the luminous edge, so better to not include it than to make it really big and obvious, or else it's just going to look weird. But it's a nice little trick you can use. So my shadow is darkest down here, towards the very bottom of my sphere, and then I'm lightening it up in the middle just a tiny bit to show where the reflected light is bouncing off the ground and up onto the object. So there's a tiny area of my shadow that's lighter from that reflected light, and then I'm darkening it up again. But this shift should be very subtle. If you make the shift in value look really pronounced, it's going to make it look odd. So make sure this part is not white, it's not even light gray, it's still a very dark gray, barely different than the rest of your shadow. And you can see that as I'm shading in this shadow, I'm really going up almost all the way around. Not all the way, not on this side, but almost all the way around with my shading. And that helps make my object look very round. Now that I've done in the darkest part of my shadow, I need to start pretty quickly fading it into a more medium value, because it's going to eventually fade all the way into my highlight. You could choose to switch pencils at some point, so I just switched from my 6B to my 2B. And notice I still haven't done any shading up here because that's going to be my lightest shading. But now that my shading is getting really nice and light, I'm going to start bringing it up around, and I'm going to start shading away that outline right there. But this should be very, very light because the light is hitting that part of the sphere. And I'm trying to leave a decent sized area, a little circular area, right around here for my highlight. That's where my light would be hitting most directly. So I'm leaving this part pure white. And all of my transitions of value should be really even. To me, as I step back and look at this from a little more of a distance, I see that my shadow right here to my light right here has a little bit of a distinct edge. So I'm going to go back and just lightly extend my shading so this shadow fades away more gradually. And I'm just doing that anywhere that I see changes of value that are not gradual enough. Down here I see the same thing. I'm going to just shade into that area a little bit more to make my changes in value more gradual. And once you get to the point where you don't see any obvious changes in value and you're satisfied with your sphere, then you are done shading your most challenging and final of the 5 basic geometric forms.